Hello everyone, how are you? I'm Mari Thurger, and today I'm going to continue to talk about the Wendish religion. This is the second part of this subject, and on the previous video I have talked about the general aspects of the Wendish religion, such as the ancestor worship, the earth cult, and the household worship, the conception of the soul, werewolves, vampire or vampiric dead, wild women, shamanic battles on mountain tops, etc., etc. Today I'm going to mostly focus on the temples, priesthood, the divine and other religious icons of the Wendish religion. So let's go straight to the point. As I've said on the previous video, most of the perceptions the Wends had about the divine was still quite animistic in nature. Their religious practices revolved around a symbiotic relationship with the natural world for the benefit of both humans and the spiritual entities. Much of the Wendish religion was quite private and performed in one's own house, and very much based on folk traditions. But they also had the worship of the gods, of course, of what they perceived to be holy. And where holiness could be found, the Wends worshipped those holy powers. So in earlier times, the Wends most likely worshipped their gods right there in the open, outside, on sacred groves and other geographical features perceived as being of great importance to directly contact with the divine. Only around the 11th and the 12th centuries, the Wends started to elaborate actual structures for the worship of the gods. If you have seen the previous video, you will understand why this late approach in building structures to harbor the divine. As I've said, the Wends were very fond of their traditional practices, and their folk traditions and animistic perceptions were well preserved until quite late. This doesn't mean that before the 11th century the Wends did not have temples. They did. But the Wends did not pay much importance to the houses of the divine. So such structures were not very elaborate, nor were they an important aspect in the daily religious lives of the Wends. It's precisely due to more contact with Scandinavians and Celts, already Christianized, that the Wends start to pay more attention to the temples. And in fact, geographically speaking and obviously archaeologically speaking, in Wendish territory, the closer they were to Scandinavians, the more information we get about their temples. In Wendish territory, far from Scandinavians and other Germanic peoples and Celts, temples are almost inexistent, and the ones that exist were not very elaborate. In the more southern regions of Wendish territory, the more archaic practices of worship in open-air spaces or groves were better preserved for a longer period in history, which means certain Slavic gods the Wends worshipped in the north were completely unknown in the south of their own territory. So, in the south, their holy groves were more noticeable, and they consisted on an area bordered by woodland, of course, and a sort of fence was constructed around the grove, a fence made of poles which were sculptures of their gods. In the north, the scenery was different. We have good examples of that, such as the temple in Refra and Großreiden in nowadays northern Germany, closer to the island of Rügen. And in that island, of course, the famous Slavic temple of the Wends called Arkona. These temples in nowadays northern Germany, closer to the Danes, were impressive structures and the centers of political power. The temple in Arkona was the citadel temple of the god Sventovit, splendidly carved and bearing various painted symbols. It was the seat of power, which the Christian Danes brought down in the second half of the 12th century, unfortunately. Aside from these major temples, in the north of the Wendish territory, it seems every tribal area had its own temple or place of worship, and each with its special idol, a special god form for each specific tribal area or district. Now, I want you to try to picture these specific temples. The outside of the temple's walls were covered or were decorated with carved images of the gods and goddesses. On the inside, the gods became more specific. The carvings had more attention to details, and the names of the gods were carved on each figure. They were carved to resemble as if they were dressed in battle gear. The most prominent deity would be a carving taller than the rest, right? Now, picture a simple wooden structure, rectangular in shape, with a roof made of timber, and all around, on the outside, a low fence. Now, the temple's walls were made of planks of the same size, and on their extremities the planks were carved to resemble a human head, an anthropomorphic figure, the ones I've previously mentioned of gods and goddesses on the outside of the temple's walls. Now, inside the temple, you would have the carved images of the gods, the ones with more detail, and the taller figure to the most prominent god. Now, I hope I was successful in creating that mind image for you. I found a picture of a reconstruction of one of these temples. To be more precise, the temple of Crossraden. Sure, I could have shown you the picture and we wouldn't waste much time, but I really want you to work on that imagination of yours, because much of our perception of the spiritual comes from inside. Now, let's talk about the priesthood. So, if there are temples, there are priests, devoted to the management of the structures and to deal with the powers of the holy, to the mutual benefit of the gods and humans. The priesthood had a great influence upon people's lives, including on political, economic, and military matters. The idea was that the divinities ruled the world, so it was up to the priests to express how things should be conducted according to the divine. The priests transmitted how people should act, all sorts of people, from the lowest social rank to the highest. Among the Wends, the high priest had more respect from the people than the king himself or the chieftain of the tribe. And the will of the gods, or the god of the specific temple, was expressed through the priest on the form of divination, through the casting of lots. Objects with the purpose of divination, just as I have expressed on the video about divination in the Germanic world. So by now you are already familiar with that procedure. The role of the Wendish priests wasn't solely restricted to divination as a method to express the will of the gods. They acted as politicians, diplomats, and played an important role in the military strategies. In fact, it was mostly due to the role of these priests that the Wends remained pagan for a longer period of time than all the rest of European cultures. Their political resistance was strong, their religious resistance. Now, the temples were obviously centers of political power to express authority, economic and military power. If foreigners wanted to trade with the Wends, they had to come to these temples and convince the priests to allow them to trade throughout Wendish territory. It was a privilege to be allowed to trade with the Wends. It was a blessing. Temples and the priests managing them were so important for the economy and politics of these people, at least in the northern regions of Wendish territory, that the priests themselves were the ones to collect taxes to increase the temple's treasury. Even a great portion of the spoils of war, mostly gold and silver, would be kept within the temple. So you can already see the impact of other cultures upon the northern Wends. But these taxes would be distributed in times of great need, such as famine or some other sort of disaster that befell these communities. The priesthood also had farmlands and cultivated the land and bred livestock, especially horses. I've expressed on the importance of the horse on the previous videos. Horse augury was one of the most used methods of divination to perceive the will of the divine. Certain gods had specific horses that belonged to them, specific colors, skin colors for specific gods. The Wendish priests presided over legal assemblies as well on Thursdays. It's true. Military policies and strategies were also influenced by the priesthood, and declarations of war of the tribes had to be approved by the priests. This also means it often happened that the priests themselves would lead a rebellion or would lead an army into battle, riding on the sacred horse on the forefront of the fight. But of course, they wouldn't go to battle all the time. In certain occasions, it was the sacred horse of the deity of the temple in which the priest took management that would go into battle, riderless, not on behalf of the priest, but as if the god himself was riding his horse and was in charge, leading people into battle. Please watch my video about the horse in Norse religion and you will better understand this aspect, since in that video I have talked about horse augury of the Wends as well. But I suppose we have time to talk a bit about that. Why not? Wendish priests obviously played the role as oracles as well. For instance, at the famous temple and the area around Arkona, a herd of horses was kept along with a holy horse. A sacred horse only the priest was allowed to touch or ride or lead him to pasture. It was the representative horse of the divine, of the deity of the temple. And only the deity itself and the priest were allowed to touch or ride the horse. Much like the Scandinavian account of Ravnakel's saga. Ravnakel being a priest of Freyr, and Freyfaxi was his horse. Only Freyr himself and Ravnakel were allowed to use the horse. So, using this horse, the Wendish priest could decide whether the tribe should go to war or not. As I've explained on the video about horse augury, this was done by laying out 3 rows of spears on the ground in a particular way, so that when the priest led the horse out of the sanctuary across the rows of spears, if the horse stepped 3 times with his left forefoot over the 3 rows of spears, war should happen. If, however, the horse stepped over the spears in any other way, war was not the will of the divine. Clearly, the priest was thought to transmit the divine will by means of casting lots and horse augury, divination or oracle. You get the point. The thing is, the casting of lots was one method and horse augury was the second method, following the casting of lots. Both methods had to be in concordance with each other, otherwise nothing would happen. One method of divination must be the confirmation of the other. But I think it's important to underline this next statement. Clearly, the Wendish priesthood had a great impact on politics, economy, and military matters. But mind that it wasn't like our perception of nowadays of the priesthood, where we clearly understand what a political matter is, what an economic issue is, and what is a military action, and the role of the real religion in all of this. To the Wendish priesthood, There wasn't a separation in all of this. And these social aspects weren't seen as being matters of politics or economy or military matters, etc. The Wendish priesthood understood that all things belonged to the spiritual. There wasn't a clear separation of matters. The spiritual and the material were more integrated as a whole, and everything was seen as belonging to the exact same, to the sacred. So we cannot transport our modern ideas of things into the past, because it wasn't perceived like that. I know I said the Wendish priesthood had a great impact on a variety of matters, but to them, in the past, everything belonged to the spiritual. So they did not detach their thinking and their actions according to the situation. They saw everything as a whole, as part of the same reality. So every action and decision was an expression of the spiritual. I hope you take my meaning. Now, let's speak about the divinities in Wendish religion. As I've already told you, from region to region within Wendish territory, there were different perceptions of the divine. And into the south, the expression of religion was more archaic. And certain gods in one place were completely unknown on another. And we obviously have the case of the same deity having different names according to the tribe and regional customs and the way things were religiously conducted. This happens with many ancient religions, and sometimes we think they had hundreds of gods, but in fact it's just different names for the same gods or aspects of the divine. Now, one of the most fascinating aspects of Wendish religion towards the images of the gods is the multiplicity of heads or faces in one single deity. This is very noticeable all across the Slavic cultural world, but most prominent in Wendish culture. Certain scholars have argued that this was a Christian creation to make the Slavic religion and their gods even more strange and abnormal for political reasons and to create fear, etc. You might have heard this, obviously, but this isn't the case actually. If we take a look into other mythologies, Roman, Celtic, Lusitanian, and such, there are a couple of gods with multiple heads or faces. Multiple heads on a divine figure symbolizes the multiple responsibilities that that deity has over a variety of realities and subjects. And it's even the multiple aspects of the deity whose power is extended into many aspects of life and death. So I think this had to be said. Now, you have also to take in mind, as I've said on the first part of this subject, the Wends didn't have a well-structured mythology, nor did they have any texts or anything that might give us some concrete idea of their gods. They relied much more on oral traditions, on folk practices, so the knowledge of the divine was kept within their own heads. However, the Wends were a people who have shown a great resilience to foreigner cultures and belief systems, and there was a considerable resistance to Christianity, and their loyalty to their gods was outstanding, and this factor was well known to many Christians around them who actually preserved much of the Wendish Slavic gods because they were fascinated by the fact that the Wends fervently protected their sanctuaries to the death. So their gods were clearly an integral part of their lives. So many Christians preserved the gods of the Wends to understand the importance they had. But obviously, the various names of the gods and goddesses of the Western Slavs were recorded by people with different linguistic backgrounds and often completely ignorant of the Slavic languages. Not only that, but the fact that within Jewish and Christian traditions, it's blasphemous to use the name of the divine. While recording the Slavic gods, they couldn't write the name of the gods, so they used other terms such as the Father, the Almighty, the Mother, which makes things even more difficult. So please keep that in mind. And let's take a look at some of the gods and goddesses of the Western Slavs. Ishvanbrat. This is a deity, we know nothing of it, but it's exclusively a Wendish deity. Bentis, the god of travelers. Jarovit, a sort of Wendish Mars, but it's important to reflect on this. The vit suffix in Sorbian language implies that the deity is connected to light, from being shining and bright, as in the perception a person has when being in contact with the holy, either having a feeling of safety or being secured. In this case, a god of war, but linked to protection and security. Lupa, the Wendish goddess of love. Zcerneboch, the sun god. The element bog was borrowed from the Iranian language in prehistoric times, which indicates being a holy power that gives, that had a direct connection with humans and the world and gives something. In this case, Zcerneboch means the giver of wealth. This deity might correspond to the deity Svarog from other parts of the Slavic world, which is also a sun god. This is a god that distributes divine gifts. Bujataya, a goddess of those who sleep. A peculiar goddess who protects and awakens those who are sleeping if there is an approaching danger or some misfortune. So she's a goddess of occasion, of a specific moment. In this case, if one is sleeping and danger is near, she wakes them up. This might be the perception of one's ancestral spirit watching over the person. Plavit, a god of wealth and fortune. Podaga, god of hunt, breeding of animals and cultivation of the fields, husbandry. A god of good weather and gentle winds that bring fertility. So this also makes him a god of storm and air. This god also appears in feminine form as a goddess of fair weather. He is the lover of the goddess of dawn, Simzeria. Now, three of the most famous gods among the Wends were Perovit, Svantovit, and Triglav. Perovit is the god of justice, of the earth, and of air. He is also a war god, a god of marriage and protector of children in their mother's wombs. Porevit has 5 faces, one of which is in his chest. Svantovit is the holy god. This was the god at the temple of Arkona, so this one had a greater importance. He was depicted as having 4 heads, or 4 faces, 2 in the front and 2 in the back. He was generally considered the highest god of the Wends, a war god as well, but also a protector god, and his sacred horse was the white horse. This would be the type of horse the priest of Zcerneboch's temple would use in horse divination and in other religious practices. On the temple of Arkona, there would be a large drinking horn on his statue that would be filled with mead during the harvest festival. So take note of that if you plan on worshipping this deity. This mead would be left there for almost a whole year until it was time for the priest to use it to foretell the next year's harvest. This was also a method of divination. Now, it's curious, when I went to Prague 2 or 3 years ago, I obviously visited the famous St. Vitus Cathedral, which is the main church of the former imperial capital of Prague. In Christian times, Sventovit was associated with St. Vitus, and the Wends continued to worship their old god in the new form of St. Vitus. Triglav literally means three-headed, portrayed as having three heads, which according to the Wendish folklore, it signifies that he rules over the three realms of heaven, earth, and the underworld. But in ancient times, you would not see the faces of this deity because in the temples, they were covered by golden veils because he did not wish to see what humans were up to. But it's curious, this idea of heaven, earth, and the underworld. This god has a lot of dualistic perceptions or conceptions, which is common to see in many of the Wendish religious concepts, but not because of Christian influences, but because of Iranian traditions in prehistory. The Wends had a long contact with Iranian tribes, which influenced some points of their religions. And most of these influences came from the contact with the Scythians and the Sarmatians. Well, there are other gods such as Porenut, with 5 heads. He is associated with the more famous Slavic god Perum, but also with Porevit. This god has a particularity. He was depicted as being unarmed, one of the very few gods that doesn't show any signs of being linked to any military aspect. Prov, god of justice, oxen and sheep were sacrificed to him. And this god is also depicted as having an iron shield, an actual iron shield. In legal matters, this shield was heated until it glowed red, and a person accused of a crime would be made to touch the shield. If the burns healed in 3 days, the accused was declared innocent. The Franks did more or less the same with pagans and people accused of witchcraft, making them pick up an iron coin from boiling water, and if the wounds healed within 3 or 5 days, they were innocent of witchcraft. Prepegla, another exclusively from the Wends, a god living in the Elbe River in nowadays Germany. Rugivit, a god of springtime and fertility. He is also known as Karevit, a god with 7 heads under one single head. He has 8 swords, 7 in his belt and 1 in his hand. He also has a feminine form known as Rago. Ziva, which means grey, a goddess which is the personification of the power of the earth. She propitiates fertility and brings forth nourishment, a goddess of luck and happiness. Svarogish. This is the Wendish or Sorbian name of the god Svarog. To the Wends, he was also a god of contracts and sworn bonds among people, a fire god as well. Zcerneboch, the black god. This god comes directly from Iranian influences upon the Slavs. He was seen as a deity of evil, and it was also important to worship him to appease this deity, honoring this deity in order to avoid feeling the effects of his powers. And this god is the equivalent of Zcerneboch, the black god of the underworld, in opposition to Berewok, the white god. This dualistic perception of light and dark, good and evil, heaven and the underworld isn't a Christian influence upon the Wends, but as I have said, it comes from an Iranian past and with the contact the Wends had with Scythians and Sarmatians. Well, I think I shall develop more on the Wendish gods later on the Patreon platform, and if I see the subject raises people's interest, I shall develop a video on it with more details. Alright, my dear friends, I hope you have enjoyed this video, and before you go, by the end of this video, you will have the sources I have consulted to make these 2 videos, the first part and the second part. So if you are interested in knowing more about the Wendish religion and the Wendish gods, etc., you might want to consult those sources. Also, if you found this video interesting, please do share it among your friends and your enemies all across the social media. And also, if you subscribe to this channel, please click on the bell icon and you will get all the notifications of everything that goes on in this channel, so you won't miss a thing. And finally, if you want to contribute to this little community and help me out to acquire sources and do a more thorough work of investigation, you can always become my patron. Now, once again, thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video, and as always, tack för idag.